So much for coming over to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program, and I'm the Kissinger Chair here at CSIS. And we're thrilled to have you today for our conference. And I want to make sure everyone has one of these, which is the conference booklet. It has full bios. I'm going to do some brief introductions, but full bios are in here. Special thank you this morning to BAE Systems for sponsoring this conference. And we're going to begin at the broadest possible level, which is really to talk about the rebalance to Asia. It's a central pillar of U.S. security strategies, I'm sure everyone knows. And we're very fortunate to be joined this morning by Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska. Senator Sullivan has taken a leading role in the Senate Armed Services Committee and in the Senate for issues relating in particular to the defense aspects of the rebalance, but of course, being from Alaska, he has a much broader perspective to bring to bear. Senator Sullivan has a distinguished record of military and national security service. He served more than 20 years on active duty and in the reserves in the United States Marine Corps. He also has served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Economics, Energy, and Business under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and as a director on the National Security Council staff at the White House for international economics. After his remarks, Senator Sullivan will be joined on stage by Dr. Mike Green, who will moderate a question and answer session. For anyone who doesn't know, Dr. Green is the Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS, and he is also the Japan Chair. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Sullivan.
Well, thanks, Kath, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be back at CSIS. I just want to start by thanking the organization here, Mike Green and others. You guys do such a great job of bringing so many different groups, some of the best minds around the world, practitioners, policymakers, academics here, and your service to what we're trying to get done clearly in this country is invaluable. So I'm very, very honored to be here. I've actually had an opportunity to work with a number of people, including, where did Dr. Green go? Mike Green and Matthew Goodman and others at CSIS, particularly on Asia issues. And I'll start by just giving a little bit of background from my perspective. I've had the opportunity to work on Asia issues, the privilege of working on Asia issues from a couple of different perspectives over the last 20 years. So first, as Kath mentioned, national security official in the Bush White House and an assistant secretary of state. As a Marine, deployed out into the region from the state of Alaska. If you look at a map, we're definitely an Asia-Pacific state. And I served as the Attorney General in Alaska, but importantly for our state, the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy, and spent quite amount of time in Asia, in Japan, in China, Korea, because those markets and those countries are very important to Alaska. And then finally now as a U.S. Senator, where given my Alaska roots and focus and my background, I've taken a very strong interest in issues that relate to Asia-Pacific economic issues, Asia-Pacific security issues, and have had an opportunity to get out to the region a couple times already as a senator who just started in January, and really great opportunities both in the region and back here to meet with the leadership when Prime Minister Abe was here, when President Xi Jinping was here, a number of other leaders. I've had the opportunity to be in those meetings. So going to continue that focus, and I think it's important certainly as an Alaskan, but also as an American. But what I wanted to do this morning was kind of broaden the scope of the discussion. I know that a lot of the conference is going to be talking about amphibious doctrine, which I have know a little bit about as a Marine infantry officer. But to talk about some of the broader foreign policy and economic issues in the Asia-Pacific, and really focus in three areas: what I call the good news, the bad news, and some thoughts on our nation's biggest national security challenge, which I'll get to at the end. So, but we're going to do a Q&A here at the end, so of course, being at CSIS, to me, the most important part of this is hearing from you, hearing from your issues, your ideas, what you're thinking are some of the big issues, and look forward to answering some of your questions. You know, I think that it goes without saying, but I think sometimes it needs to be repeated, that the United States, in terms of our foreign policy, our national security policies, is strongest when you have the executive branch and the legislative branch working together, when you have Democrats and Republicans working together. And I think that's traditionally been the strength of American foreign policy. And I'm certainly somebody who believes in the relevance and reading the U.S. Constitution on a regular basis. I used to actually carry a little pocket version when I was campaigning. But if you look at the setup of our government, it actually sets up the government in a way that has both the executive branch and the legislative branch with significant foreign policy and national security powers. Some have talked about that as an invitation to struggle over foreign policy, but I think it's more of a requirement and an impetus by the Founding Fathers to work together on foreign policy. Now, in many places in the world, this is, unfortunately, in my view, obviously not happening. Iran is the most obvious example. We just had a huge debate with regard to the Iranian deal that the president negotiated with 6 other countries. And this made history, but in a lot of ways it made history that I don't think people should take a lot of pride in. Why? First time, really ever, that the United States has had a major foreign policy agreement with huge national security implications where we've moved forward on an agreement like that, not on the basis of a bipartisan majority in the Congress, which has been the tradition. If you look at the history of the United States, on almost every big foreign policy deal, bipartisan majority. This moved forward on the basis of a partisan minority. I don't think that's good news for the country. So what is the good news? I said I was going to initially talk about good news. Well, I think a strong case can be made that with one of President Obama's most important foreign policy initiatives, the so-called rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, that we still are in a place where we can get back to this area of a strong bipartisan support for an important policy initiative that has support from both parties and the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, I know there's been a lot of discussion. I know there's going to be more talk about it today. I look forward to discussing it, on exactly what the rebalance is. Is it real? What does it entail when the administration talks about it? In my view, right now it focuses on 2 strategic aspects. But as I mentioned in an article, and hopefully you have some of the materials that we provided, I actually think it should be a 3-pronged strategy. What is it right now? Well, first, there's clearly a trade and economic component to the rebalance strategy. And with the passage of Trade Promotion Authority, the recent completion of the TPP, this clearly is very real indeed. Now, I was somebody who worked closely with the administration as a strong proponent of trade, strong proponent of TPA, worked with Ambassador Froman, Secretary Pritzker, Secretary Liu on trying to get the votes, which we got in the Senate, by the way, by 1 vote, on TPA, and am very much, like a lot of other senators, digging in to the TPP to see what it holds. To be honest, I'm a little bit concerned about some of the aspects of it, and we can talk about some of those. But the broader strategic aspects of this agreement are very important, and I think most of us recognize that. Second, there's the military rebalance. And again, a lot of discussion on that in the Defense Authorization Bill, which is going to the President's desk here in a couple days, passed in strong bipartisan votes in the Senate. I had an amendment that was part of that bill that focused on the rebalance, that focused on the importance of the rebalance. And again, I think that that's something that is a very important strategy where you're seeing a lot of bipartisan support for it. One element I think that's overlooked on that's an important element to some of our allies, certainly, is if you look at the spending in the next several years on the rebalance, in terms of military terms, in terms of military redeployment of American troops throughout the region, the estimates are about close to $37 billion of additional spending for construction, for moving Marines to different parts of the Asia-Pacific. About $31 billion of that 37 are going to be spending that's actually picked up by our allies in the region, mostly Japan and Korea. It's a huge deal. It gets overlooked a lot, including over $3 billion for a significant construction in Guam by a U.S. ally on American territory. I think that's probably the first time that that's happened in such significant quantities. So that is important, and I think that there's a good start there, and it's something that, as somebody who's already been out to the region, focusing on these military issues, very, very important for the United States and our allies in the region. The third component I think that we're missing in terms of our rebalance strategy, and I mentioned it in an article in The Hill a couple months ago, is on energy. Energy. Now, as Alaska's senator, you can imagine this is an important topic to me, but there's been a number of foreign policy experts. We just had an Armed Services Committee hearing recently where General Jones, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, former NATO commander, knows a little bit about energy, given his role at the Commerce, at the U.S. Chamber. He talked about how this is an incredible new instrument of American power. And yet we don't use it, we don't think about it, we don't think about it in strategic terms at all. And even Secretary Carter, during his confirmation hearing, I talked to him about energy during his confirmation hearing. He absolutely agreed. Critical new element of American power. But this administration hasn't really focused on it at all. As a matter of fact, I think because they have an aversion to hydrocarbons, they purposely downplay it. Well, they shouldn't. I mean, in Alaska right now, we're looking at a huge, massive LNG project that would create tens of thousands of jobs for Americans throughout the country, energy security, energy to our allies and others. China's interested in energy from the United States. I think we should be certainly welcoming and open to that. And by the way, it also would help the environment, not hurt it, as you hear sometimes. Why? Because the United States is a jurisdiction that has the highest standards in the world on the environment. If we're not producing energy in America, we're driving it to regimes like Russia that really don't have any standards on the environment. So, to me, this is win, 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 win everywhere. And yet we need to seize it. So to me, that should be the third part of our rebalance strategy that would benefit us and our allies. So that's the good news. I think we have the makings, certainly, of a coherent strategy in the Asia-Pacific that does have strong support, bipartisan, both parties, and both critical branches of government in the executive branch and the legislative branch. So what's the bad news? I talked about good news. That is good news. What's the bad news? Well, I think in terms of the overall credibility of American foreign policy in different regions of the world, we are starting to see our credibility as a nation start to crumble. You can't pick up a paper, turn on the news, read op-eds, meet with our allies across the world and not hear serious concerns about the state of America's credibility in terms of our foreign policy and national security. So this waning credibility comes in many forms. The first and the most obvious is when the president or a senior cabinet official comes out with some kind of declaration of American foreign policy and then fails to meet that, fails to act. The Syria Red Line, of course, is the greatest example of that, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. But there are other areas where we're starting to see an erosion of American credibility. Let me give you a few other examples. Dismissing advances by our adversaries or countries challenging the United States in a way that seems almost divorced from reality, that downplays the strategic aspects of some of these challenges. Again, Russia's move into Syria. The president has said that's based on weakness from Russia and Putin. Really? Based on weakness. I'm not sure that's the view in Damascus, or in Tehran, or in Europe, or in Baghdad. Again, it seems like there's a divorced element from reality here. The North Korea issue. Just in a press conference with President Park a couple days ago, President Obama stated, quote, North Korea's nuclear and missile programs have achieved nothing except to deepen North Korea's isolation. Well, I'm not sure they've achieved nothing. They're a challenge, and we need to recognize it. Another area in terms of credibility where we make enormous, in many ways historic, accommodations to what have been traditional U.S. adversaries, and then after that, we see these countries making even further aggressive anti-U.S. statements, anti-U.S. speeches, or anti-U.S. moves. If you see the Castro speech at the UN, just blatantly anti-American after months and months of accommodating this regime, this dictatorship. And of course, the Iran deal. What do we see from the Iran deal? When we've been told by Secretary Kerry, hey, we're going to actually see more cooperation after this deal with Iran. What have we seen? Troops on the ground in Syria, Washington Post reporter convicted of espionage, a statement from the Iranian leadership that Israel shouldn't exist after 25 years, and what clearly last week was a violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and in my view, the Iranian agreement with the United States on firing ballistic missiles over 1,000 miles. This is not where American credibility in terms of foreign policy is being built up. Finally, and in terms of credibility, I think that in certain regions of the world, like the Middle East, where the U.S. has had the leadership role in terms of the international security infrastructure for decades, we're starting to withdraw. Whether we admit it or not, we're starting to withdraw. So these are signs of waning credibility. And as you know, credibility is the coin of the realm of effective American foreign policy. But I believe we are starting to get to a place where our friends no longer trust us and our adversaries no longer fear us. So is this happening in the Asia Pacific as well? I think it's having an impact. I think it's having an impact. I think it's very difficult to say, hey, we have strong credibility in the Asia Pacific, but we don't have it in the Middle East. I think our allies ask the question, what's going on in this region? Is that going to impact us in our region? And I do think the credibility of the United States in the Asia Pacific is being challenged. And I think it's actually a result of rhetoric, again, where the United States makes statements and then it's not being met by our actions. Let me provide two recent examples in the Asia Pacific. As many of you saw in the recent U.S.-China state visit, President Obama and President Xi highlighted this cybersecurity agreement between our two countries. This is after what I think is most is recognized by people who focus on this, that the Chinese have been very aggressive in terms of their cyber issues with regard to the United States in terms of companies, in terms of personnel. The OPM issue is certainly something that impacted a lot of us. Dr. Green, I'm sure that your background materials in terms of, I'm just kidding. But these are important issues. And yet, yesterday in the press, we see that it was reported that Chinese government entities were almost certainly, almost within a day or two after that meeting, continuing those kind of activities. So what will we do? How are we going to respond to that? Again, to me, that's U.S. credibility on the line. Let me give you another one that is a bigger topic that I know is going to be discussed today. You know, I had the opportunity to go to the Shangri-La Dialogue that I'm sure many of you attended in Singapore several months ago on a very bipartisan basis. Went with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Senator McCain, the ranking member of that committee, Senator Reid, Joni Ernst from Iowa. We went there to support the rebalance. And Secretary Carter gave a very strong, powerful speech that we all attended. Not only did we attend, but we met with him earlier, talked about us working together, walked around the conference together to show what I talked about at the beginning. Strong, bipartisan, American foreign policy in a critical region with the executive branch, the Secretary of Defense, the legislative branch, the chairman, and the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, and some new senators like myself. In the speech, Secretary Carter stated with regard to the South China Sea, quote, "There should be no mistake. The United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, as U.S. forces do all over the world. America, alongside its allies and partners in the regional architecture, will not be deterred from exercising these rights, the rights of all nations." He went on to say, quote, "After all, turning an underwater rock into an airfield simply does not afford the rights of sovereignty or permit restrictions on international air or maritime transit." That was an important statement at a very important conference. And after that statement in a press conference, the members of the Senate who were there were very supportive. So what's happened? In the aftermath of that speech, we haven't done anything. As a matter of fact, in follow-up hearings on the Senate Armed Services Committee with the PACOM Commander Admiral Harris, through questioning from myself and others, it became clear that there was a debate about whether to go within the 12-mile zone of some of these islands. And that, although it wasn't stated with certainty, it seemed very clear that most of the agencies, including the U.S. military, wanted to do that, to follow up on what Secretary Carter said was U.S. policy. And it also became very clear that the White House was saying no. In this hearing, it was clear that the White House has been saying no to this for 3 years. And that some of it may have been to make sure that the upcoming state visit by the President of China went well. Well, I think that's a misreading of how you use leverage in terms of international affairs. So, in terms of the press, just recently, the last couple days, again, there's been leaks in the press saying, no, we're really going to do it this time. Really. Seriously. Promise. Okay, we'll see. But this is, again, a case of U.S. credibility. Are there risks to any kind of action like this? Are there risks to send a Navy ship within 12 miles of some of these newly built-up islands? Of course. Of course there are. China right now is making strong protests when they've seen these leaks in the paper. But inaction, particularly in terms of a de facto recognition of these man-made islands, also carries risk. And in my view, it entails greater risk. Certainly our allies are watching. They're watching all of this. And I don't think the United States can afford continued diminishment of its credibility in the Asia Pacific. I think there's also precedent here to learn from. And many of you are very familiar with what happened, what's now been referred to as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis in the spring of 1996, where President Clinton ordered 2 carrier battle groups to the region in response to what were tensions and, to be perfectly honest, provocative actions with regard to Taiwan's elections during that time. There was also a debate during that time that in many ways mirrors the debate now about not only sending American forces and credibility in the region, but to send a naval ship through the Taiwan Strait at the time. We hadn't done that in years during that time. China had claimed that was an internal waterway during that time. And I remember there was a radio show that had 2 different American foreign policy experts debating this. One saying, no, this would be provocative, another saying, no, this is international waterways. We need to make sure it's clear that we have the ability to use these. And we did it. We did send a ship, a large marine amphibious assault ship, the U.S. Bella Wood. It's a flat top with thousands of Marines and sailors on it, through the Taiwan Strait at that time. I remember that because I was an infantry officer on that ship during that time. I remember listening to the radio debate that was piped into my room on the ship as we were in the middle of the Taiwan Strait. And we have done that regularly, on a regular basis since that time. So as you can tell, I believe that our foreign policy credibility, whether globally or in the Asia-Pacific, is starting to wane. And I think that most of these are self-inflicted wounds. But it's also not surprising that in the Asia-Pacific region, the issue of U.S. foreign policy has increasingly concerned China, which brings me to the final point of my remarks. I believe that the rise of China and how we address this issue strategically is the most important and the most pressing national security issue that we will face as a country in the next generation. Now, a lot of very smart people have been saying this for years. One of my mentors is Bob Zoellick, who many of you know, head of the World Bank, former Deputy Secretary of State, former U.S. Trade Rep, certainly in my view, one of the most strategic thinkers that we have in our country. He talked about this over 10 years ago in his well-known responsible stakeholder speech. And more recently, in an article in The Atlantic, Professor Graham Allison of Harvard talked about this issue. He talked about what he called the Thucydides trap. And he stated, quote, "The preeminent geostrategic challenge of this era is not violent Islamic extremists or a resurgent Russia. It is the impact that China's ascendance will have on the U.S.-led international order." More specifically, Professor Allison writes that the defining question about the global order is whether China and the U.S. can escape what he calls the Thucydides trap, the term that he coined to describe the strategic dilemma and dangers that occur when a rising power rivals a ruling power, as when in ancient Greece, Athens challenged Sparta, which led to the Peloponnesian War, and was detailed by the renowned Greek historian Thucydides. So Graham Allison says this won't be easy to avoid the trap. He actually concludes in his article, quote, "War between the U.S. and China is more likely than recognized at the moment," unquote. This is Graham Allison. This is not some warmonger. I think if you read his article, it's pretty sobering. And I've seen how this won't be easy, just dealing with the relationship in my experience. As I've mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in Asia. I've spent a lot of time in China. One of my most memorable meetings ever was the opportunity I had as a young NSC staffer where I was with Bob Zoellick, where we had just completed the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, the negotiations for that agreement. all-night negotiation. And the next day, I had the rare opportunity for a young guy to accompany Bob Zoellick to go meet with Lee Kuan Yew for 2 hours of discussing the world. Now, I didn't say anything in that meeting. I just listened. But it was very interesting as he talked about things, and later in a book that talked a lot about Lee Kuan Yew's interviews, he was asked, are China's leaders serious about replacing the U.S. as the top power in Asia? Lee Kuan Yew's answer was, quote, of course. Why not? How could they aspire not to be number one in Asia and in time number one in the world, unquote. He talked about how the world has never seen a power like China. One example that I've used a couple times that I think gives you a sense of how quickly this growth is happening is that in 1980, China's economy was smaller than the Netherlands. Last year, the incremental growth in China's economy was the size of the Netherlands economy. And as for whether China wants to see itself or believes that it should be, quote, a responsible stakeholder in the international system designed by the U.S. that has certainly benefited China tremendously, Lee Kuan Yew is very complimentary to Bob Zoellick about that term and about that strategic thought, is very skeptical. He says, quote, China wants to be China and accepted as such, not as an honorary member of the West, unquote. So where does that leave us? I certainly see that the rise of China has challenges, as we're talking about, but enormous opportunities. And I'm not somebody, as a member of the Senate, who has a very strong interest in the region, view myself as any kind of China basher. But it's very important to look at both the challenges and opportunities. I'll mention one opportunity very quickly, just from my state of Alaska. Enormous opportunities. China recently overtook Japan as our largest export market. My state is small in terms of population, but we're a huge export powerhouse for the United States, given how small we are. Last year, Alaskans exported $1.5 billion of goods to China, replacing Japan as our number one market. And I think as we think about this, and contrary to what I think you read about in the paper, the U.S. is capable of long-term strategic thinking, long-term strategy, and the implementation of that strategy. We're all familiar with George Kennan's X article and what he did in terms of laying out a strategy that was followed for decades by Republicans, by Democrats, by the Congress, by the executive branch, in terms of a strategy of containment to deal with the Soviet Union. But here's the rub. We have to take time to think about this. The Senate is actually set up to do that more than other institutions in the United States government. If you look at the Federalist Papers, Madison talks about the long terms of the Senate, the strategic aspects, how they can have an influence on long-term strategic thinking in terms of American foreign policy. We need to do that better with experts like you. And I don't think that's happening enough right now, which prompted me recently, and I believe we have copies, to take to the Senate floor and just talk about the importance of this issue. A few other senators and I had the opportunity to meet with President Xi Jinping recently, and so I thought it was important to go on the Senate floor and talk about, hey, this is a really important issue. Certainly nobody has all the answers yet, but we need to think more. We need to focus on this more. So in my remarks, nothing profound there, but I laid out a couple things that we need to think about. And I'll just end with those. First, I think it's critical that we, as I've been talking about throughout my remarks this morning, we have to reestablish American credibility in the world of foreign policy and national security. If the President of the United States says he's going to do something, says we're going to do something, we need to do it. Second, I think one thing that we often lack in the United States is studying the past, studying history, particularly in this region. China is very focused on its history. We're not so much focused on ours or the history of the region. We need to understand it better. Third, we have a tremendous network of allies in the region that we have built up for decades. We need to listen to our allies, take into account their views, and certainly redouble our efforts to strengthen these alliances. I think we've seen some good progress on this in terms of recent defense guidelines with Japan. And interestingly, the rise of China seems to be bringing not only allies closer, but other countries closer to the United States. We certainly saw this in our bilateral meetings at the Shangri-La Dialogue. There was an interesting article by Philip Stevens in the FT just the last couple days in the Financial Times about India with the title, quote, China spurs Modi's pivot to Washington. And it's about how India is very interested in deepening relationships with the United States and Japan and Australia. And we should view those as important opportunities. And finally, critically, to me, the most important issue that rarely gets talked about in terms of strategy, that, to be honest, is the biggest surprise as a new senator that is almost never mentioned in terms of how critical it is to the United States for strategic reasons, is our economy. We have to get back to a strong American economy. It's the issue that's never talked about. As a matter of fact, it's the issue that, in terms of Washington, in my view, has been dumbed down. What do I mean? Traditional levels of American GDP growth over the last 100 years have been about 3.5%, 4%. Democrat, Republican, depressions, recessions, 4%, 100 years, up until 2014. This is what's made the United States strong. It's what's made us have a strong military. It's the cornerstone of so much that's happened in our country. It's the cornerstone, in my view, of addressing so many problems. The last 7 years, we barely break 2% GDP growth. We're growing about 1.5%, 2%. And nobody seems to talk about it. When we do talk about it here in Washington, we talk about it as the new normal. That, don't worry, this is actually what we need to live with. This is what our expectations should be. I think that's a very dangerous concept. We should be shooting to traditional levels of American growth. Period. And there are a whole host of reasons, in my view, why we can't grow, why we haven't grown. But nobody, including especially the Obama administration, is focused on it. The first quarter of this year, we went into recession. We shrunk by 0.8%. Did you see the Secretary of the Treasury or the President come out, hold a press conference? Don't worry, America, we're back in recession, but we got a way to fix it. We don't even talk about it. And to me, if we stay at these anemic levels of growth, the challenges of the Thucydides trap that Professor Allison talks about are going to increase, not decrease. Because as Bob Zoellick talked about in his responsible stakeholder speech over 10 years ago, you hear voices that perceive China solely through the lens of fear. But America succeeds when we look to the future as an opportunity, not when we fear what the future might bring. To me, the critical thing is we need to be confident about our own future. And that stems from economic growth. If we do that, we will be able to address these challenges. We will be able to address this important strategic challenge that I know all of you are focused on. And I just want to end by saying I'm optimistic that we'll avoid that trap, that working with our allies, working with the Chinese, working with smart people like Mike Green and many others, we can set forth a strategy that does that. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to say a few words, and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Senator, thank you. Fantastic scene setter for an important conference today on amphibious capabilities in Asia, but really that discussion has to be overlaid on the trade, security, and energy linkages that you just laid out for us. I'll ask one or two quick questions. Thank you for not mentioning my OPM record in public. And then we'll turn to the audience for one or two as well. I completely agree with you the U.S. is capable of strategy. You mentioned Kennan. Kennan, in his internal SC documents, quoted Mahan and Theodore Roosevelt, who quoted and were influenced by Matthew Perry, who was influenced by David Porter, the first captain of a U.S. warship in 1814 to go into the Pacific with a full complement of sailors and Marines. And he said, 200 years ago, our defensive line has to be in the littoral, in this island chain. In 1996, when you were a lieutenant, yeah, on the Belleau Wood, you went through the Taiwan Straits, and we could go through the Taiwan Straits. But now, the threat to that island chain is much more complicated, much more dangerous. And I completely agree with you on the need for action, freedom of navigation exercise, something to show that our words are backed by our deeds. But there is a counter-argument, and I want to give you a chance to reply. Some people say, look, you're from Alaska. You export more to China than to Japan. Why would you put that at risk by doing this? Or why would you put climate change negotiations, where we know China as the largest emitter is the key? Why would we put those at risk in Paris to do this? Aren't we winning anyway? China's reputation is being damaged. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the counter-argument that we don't need to do anything, and if we do, we put other larger equities at risk with China.
Well, look, I think if you, as I mentioned, I think if you don't do anything, that you're providing de facto recognition to what I don't think anyone agrees is a proper reading of what international law allows, what our interests are in the South China Sea. And so it's always easy to focus on the risks of action. What's more difficult is to focus on the risks of inaction, because the risks of inaction they come slowly. It's not a dramatic movement. But the risks of inaction, I think, particularly in an area like this, that's critical to the United States, that we have been essentially the protector of the sea lanes globally since the end of World War II. This benefits us. It benefits our allies. It benefits China. And so, but I think particularly on this issue, we are at a high point, or maybe a low point, depending on how you look at it, for American credibility. We've stated it. These leaks in the press are saying we're going to go do this. And it's not to challenge China. It's to make sure that the open trading system, that the sea lanes that have been part of the international system continue to be that way. My preference would be, if we do something, which we should, you can tell I'm an advocate for that we should do it with some allies. And, but to recognize a de facto, because remember, it begins with the 12-mile radius around a submerged island that's been built up. But there's statements right now saying that the entire South China Sea is China's territorial waters. Well, I don't think anyone believes that. So this is a very important issue, and it shouldn't be an issue that's viewed as kind of us versus China. It should be an issue that is, this is what we've been doing globally, every country in the region, for decades. And we need to make sure that facts on the ground don't completely overturn the status quo of what's worked well for the United States, for our allies in the region, and for the Chinese. So I think it's a very important issue, and I think that other equities it's not a black and white issue. You move forward on this, you're not going to lose cooperation on other things, but it's important.
Yeah. And if you don't move now, and then you don't move the next time, and then the next time after that, then when you do move, you do start to actually put those other equities at
Well, I
greater
think
risk,
that
right?
not only the other equities, but I think that's a really good point, Mike, is that the longer you wait, too, I think the higher the risks become.
Yeah.
And to me, that's another calculation that we need to think through.
So we're going to talk for the rest of the day about amphibious issues, and you've been assigned or sentenced by Senator McCain to focus on the rebalance.
Yeah.
And I know you've spent a lot of time traveling to the region and looking at the so-called Guam laydown plan, the plan
Right.
to disperse the Marines. I'd be interested, I think everyone would be, in your initial take on this. There are questions, positive dimensions in terms of engagement, presence,
Yeah.
shaping, real questions about lift,
Yeah.
logistics. What's your, I know you're still looking at it, but what's
Sure.
your initial take?
Well, look, I was out there in the region a couple times. I was with as I mentioned, with Senator McCain in Singapore. I went to Vietnam with him, which was an experience I'll likely never forget, to see a real American hero in a place that he obviously suffered a lot from, but then became quite the statesman. And, the reception the Vietnamese have for John McCain is remarkable when you see that. It's really remarkable. And then I went out there on my own, as I mentioned, to PACOM, to Guam, to Okinawa, where I was stationed as a Marine many years ago, and to Tokyo to meet with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, Chief Cabinet Secretary, and many others in Japan. I think the laydown is beginning to happen in a positive way. For those of you who've been to Guam, you see that it's a very, very busy place in terms of construction, and you look at a map, that's a critically important place strategically, and there's good cooperation going on there between the government, between our forces, between Japan. The congressional oversight, I think, is something that's important. Senator McCain, Senator Webb, and others have previously been very active in this, because I think from the Pentagon's perspective, they probably, I wouldn't say screwed it up, but there was a lot of cost estimates and overruns in terms of this redeployment of Marines that were a concern to a lot of people in the Congress. I know CSIS and Mike in particular have really led the way on a lot of that. But as it's moving forward, the issue of strategic lift does become very important. And this has been raised. I've certainly raised it in Armed Services Committee hearings because, for example, just with regard to the Marines, if you're taking Marines from Okinawa and having a much more broader dispersion to Guam, to Hawaii, to Australia, as that happens, there's obviously strategic aspects that make sense from a dispersion standpoint, but to be able to kind of concentrate forces at a time when they're needed, if you don't have the strategic lift to do that, that becomes a problem. And as you all know, the Asia is a very, very big place. The Asia Pacific is a very big place. And right now, I think it's recognized that we don't have the strategic lift that reinforces and supports the rebalance in a way that makes sense from a military standpoint. And I think that's something we need to continue to work on.
One of the opportunities we may have is that Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Philippines all want to grow their amphibious capabilities
Right.
and all want to do it with us. Do you think we could have some kind of, we don't have a NATO, we don't have a collective security system, but do you think, could you envision a kind of consortium, if you will, of strategic lift maneuver, given all the interest
Absolutely.
in amphibious capabilities?
And I think that kind of, again, we saw in Shangri-La the growing interest on that issue, the growing interest of the U.S. Marine Corps as almost a convening force in the Asia Pacific in terms of amphibious operations, amphibious training. Obviously, the United States Marine Corps has a lot of history in the region in terms of presence, but also in terms of real-world amphibious operations. And I think doing something along those lines goes back to the issue that I highlighted in my remarks. It goes back to credibility. And certainly our military forces in the region have a lot of credibility if you look at their history. But the interest on the amphibious side in terms of working together, and some of our allies, as you know, don't always find it so comfortable to be working together. And if they're working together through the United States, through the United States military, through the United States Marine Corps as a convening force, I think that's a great opportunity that we should look to explore more.
Thanks. Let me open it up, and I'm very happy to take questions on Asia broadly. Yes, sir.
Senator, thank you very much for your comments. What is the long-term thinking about expanding the U.S. military manpower in the Navy? I know there's been some recent reductions. What's the long-term thought, at least in the Senate?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of interest in that. You know, the Secretary of the Navy talks about a Navy of 300 ships. I think that that's something that there's a lot of interest in, maybe, in my view, exceeding that. But what we need to do is get over the initial hurdles right now. I think that our sequestration issues are obviously something that's a big focus in the Congress, big focus with the White House. You know, we did put forward a defense authorization bill that goes above the sequestration levels by, I think the number's 48 billion, 38 billion, which was about where the president wanted to have the budget. That's an important component. Ironically, amazingly, in my view, the president is contemplating vetoing the defense authorization bill, which would be stunning. I think that's only happened 4 times in the last 60 years. So there is a focus. We did in the defense authorization bill accelerate some of the timelines on, I think, 2 large-scale amphibious ships. Is that right, 2? 1, okay. But there is a lot of interest in that issue. And again, I think the positive news here is that a lot of that interest is bipartisan. The Armed Services Committee is a very bipartisan committee. And the NDAA was voted out, I think, with only 4 senators voting against it. And that bill passed the Senate with 73 senators voting for it. So there's a lot of interest in the issue that you raised in a positive way.
Hi, Brian Kato with Mitsubishi Corporation. Thank you for your comments, Senator. Earlier you mentioned that you had some thoughts on the drawbacks but also possible benefits of the TPP. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts on that, especially if you could mention how you think it might impact the energy industry, which you mentioned as being an important strategic component for the rebalance.
Well, I'll give you one just very quick way in which it would impact the energy component of the rebalance is to export, for example, LNG. I mean, think about what's going on in the United States. 10 years ago, we were working hard to make sure we were going to import LNG to have energy security for Americans. Within 10 years, which is pretty quick in the energy industry, through the innovation of American entrepreneurs. By the way, the federal government had almost 0, probably less than 0 to do with this because they haven't been helpful. We have now gotten to the place where we're the largest producer of natural gas in the world. We're the largest producer of oil in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia. More gas than Russia. We did that in 10 years. It's a huge, giant opportunity for our country, for our workers, for energy security, for our allies. And I've been over to Japan many times because, you know, a lot of people don't know Alaska's actually been exporting LNG to Japan for 40 years. We were the pioneer in terms of exporting LNG anywhere in the world. So we have the longest record of reliably supplying our allies on energy of any place on Earth. So with regard to TPP, one example would be, you know, for each, the Department of Energy goes through this very long process of export licenses to foreign countries for LNG. Takes way too long. Alaska's large-scale project that I mentioned actually has an export license to Japan and other places. But with regard to the TPP, if that were passed, every country in that arrangement would automatically have the ability to export, to receive exports of American energy without the need for any additional bureaucratic delays from the federal government like the Department of Energy. So that's just one aspect in terms of energy. There's a whole host of others. From a strategic standpoint, I think, obviously this is the United States engaging very strongly in terms of economic issues in the Asia Pacific, which most countries, whether it's Japan or others, are interested in. I noted the president of Korea's comments that Korea's interested in joining the TPP. As President Obama has said, we're either going to write the rules of the road on economic issues in the Asia Pacific in this century, or countries like China will. Well, I think it would be better if we did. And so to me, there's a very important strategic aspect. I am a little concerned, as I mentioned, we got to look hard at this deal. The fact that, senators like Orrin Hatch have come out with a lot of skepticism, probably the strongest proponent of TPA and TPP. We got to think hard. Michael Froman was quoted in Politico today saying, there's no way we're ever going to renegotiate this deal. Sounds like what they said on the Iran deal. Well, the history of the United States Senate and Congress is that whether it's on trade deals or other deals, there's a lot of deals, dozens in the history of our country where an administration has brought deals back to the U.S. Congress and we've said, not good enough. Go back and get a better deal. So if that's possible, maybe that's possible. I'm not sure. I'm digging into it right now, but there's no doubt that there are very important geostrategic aspects to the TPP that certainly are going to be in any calculation as the Congress looks to approve or disapprove the deal.
Can I ask one last quick question before we let you get back to your day job?
Yeah.
Well, as you know, Kath Hicks and I are now co-directing an independent review of the rebalance. The legislation, it's our second time doing it, but this time the legislation includes a requirement for us to look at the Arctic in the context of a Pacific strategy. I may be wrong, but I think PACOM drew the Arctic out of its area of responsibility. In any case, I think you may have had something to do with that.
I did.
Okay, thank you. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a hint as we work on this. Tell us a bit about the Arctic in the context of the Asia-Pacific littoral and the strategic issues we'll be discussing.
Well, there's a lot of interest in the Arctic, and because of transportation routes that are opening up, because of course, energy and natural resource issues, because of the environmental issues. It's, again, you can't pick up the paper in the last 4 months. There's been front page articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsweek, all about the important geostrategic aspects of the Arctic. Most Americans don't realize it, but I certainly do, and Alaskans do. The United States is an Arctic nation. We're an Arctic nation because of Alaska. So thank you, Russia, for that nice deal that you gave us several decades ago. But a lot of countries, the Russians certainly are taking a very strong interest, and so are the Chinese. Let me give you one example that caught a lot of people off guard. President Obama was visiting Alaska, first time ever, in August. The Chinese sent 5 Navy ships to the Aleutian Islands. Very close within the 12-mile radius. Those aren't built-up islands. Those have actually been there for, millennia. So there's no question about but they were probing. It was very interesting. I asked Admiral Harris, what was going on there, right? Were you focused on that? That was after a joint Russian-Chinese exercise up near that part of the Arctic and the Pacific. And, was that kind of a provocation because the president was in Alaska and now they're going to send 5 Chinese Navy ships to Alaska, which is what happened. It's quite interesting. He wasn't sure what it was, but it certainly was news. But in terms of military strategy, if you look at the Arctic, if you actually look at Alaska, we are one of these places where kind of the classic seams of American combatant commands. So PACOM actually does have, in terms of operational control, the forces in Alaska. We have a lot of military forces in Alaska. NORTHCOM, kind of from a territorial standpoint, EUCOM, STRATCOM, Alaska has pieces of all of that. Our Arctic has pieces of all of that. And so there is a provision in the NDAA that requires not only a study to look at how we're dealing with these seams, it actually requires an O plan, an operation plan for the Arctic. For the American military members in the audience today, you know what that means. That's a big undertaking by the U.S. military, and that's mandated by the Defense Authorization Bill. That was another amendment of mine. And, but that's because this is a very important area, and it plays right into the Pacific, because in many ways it is the Pacific. Again, I think from a strategic perspective right now, the United States is not thinking well enough about this. Secretary Carter has even stated, hey, we admit we're late to the game in terms of the Arctic. If you look at what the Russians are doing in the Arctic, they are dramatically increasing their military forces in the Arctic. 13 new airfields, 4 new brigade combat teams, a brand new Arctic military command, 3 massive large-scale military exercises in the last year. What are we doing? The Department of Defense decided to remove the only airborne brigade combat team in the entire Arctic and the entire Asia Pacific from Alaska. Well, I think that's a strategic blunder. And what we are now have a commitment from the Chief of Staff of the Army is before they move any forces out of the Arctic, they're going to do this op plan to see if that makes strategic sense to be removing forces when all the other major powers of the world are increasing forces in this strategic area. So stay tuned on that one. Maybe CSIS can have a conference on the Arctic. I'd be glad to come back.
Good.